Pines in the pines where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines where the sun never shines, there's a grave that's shaded with the pines.
Hi, I'm Joe Scavarini, and we're here at Step Back in Time, a program of local history presented to you by Nine Star. Our guest today is Pastor Gary Wright, I should say maybe Director Gary Wright from World Renewal Ministry here in Hancock County. What's World Renewal, Gary?
World Renewal is a interdenominational Christian mission organization that works both locally and globally in ministering to people across this country and around the world. And we are predominantly an organization that endeavors to build leadership globally with nationals coming alongside them, helping them, serving them to accomplish their dreams, and doing the same here in the United States with leaders. For instance, just this last week, we had someone approach us who does men's ministries across this nation, and during this COVID crisis that we've had, it became very difficult for him to travel and get engagements, but he's coming under our umbrella, and we'll do our best to help him do those men's ministries across the United States, and yet to be able to do that for a vocation and living. And then that's an example of how we approach things. We're basically what I call a servant organization, serving leaders and building churches, building schools, building orphanages, whatever a particular community needs, we try to help them do it.
Now, Gary, how many mission statements do you serve?
We have some kind of staff presence in over 30 countries in the world.
And you're out in rural Hancock County, right?
Well, our headquarters is a pole barn in Blue River Township, just east of Greenfield on a farm.
How long's it been there?
We moved here in really, I guess, 1998 and built a house and then built the pole barn and moved the headquarters to Hancock County and Greenfield. Previous to that, we were in Ohio. We began in 1986 out near Dodge City, Kansas, right in the southern central part of Kansas, and returned back to both my wife and I's home area here in Hancock County.
Now, the name Wright, and that's your last name, right, is probably very familiar in northeast Hancock County. Why is that?
Because of we as a family kind of got things off the ground, Orville and Wilbur. And
Oh, really?
So we got it off the ground in North Carolina, but it started really in Dayton, Ohio, in their bicycle shop. And I'm not sure what it proves about our family when two guys look at each other who are tinkering around with bicycles, and one of them had to say, I think, brother, we can make these things fly.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that proves about our family, other than maybe a little craziness running.
Didn't you have a singing group that was popular in northeast Hancock County?
We have a group that mostly comprised of Indiana boys that traveled with me for 27 years across the country and globally, called Renewal Band. And good old Indiana guys. And now all of them are grandpas, and we still occasionally do things, but we're just lucky now to be able to physically do the steps to get on stage and that sort of thing, being grandpas. So
Now, your grandfather's name was what?
Paul Milner.
Is that Milner Corners Milner?
It's the same name. I don't really have any family stories about Milner's Corner, but it is the same last name,
And
Milner.
from the same area?
And my grandfather, which was my maternal grandfather, was born and raised in Wilkinson, Indiana, here, and that which would be Brown Township, I believe.
Yes, that's right. And where'd you go to high school at?
Well, I started out going to Wilkinson Elementary School, and then when Eastern Hancock came into existence with the consolidation of Charlottesville, Wilkinson, and of course Wilkinson had already consolidated with Shirley, and so that was where I went to school. My last 2 years of school, my parents built a house near Knightstown, so I ended up graduating from Knightstown. And I had to kind of keep that quiet now that I live in Eastern Hancock School District, because Knightstown and Eastern Hancock have been known to express some hostilities towards one another.
Really?
At times. Yeah.
Surprising. Do you have some sports lore you can talk to us about?
I sure do. I think for a show like yours of stepping back in time and looking at history, I think my grandfather, Milner, Paul Milner, is a really interesting historical figure if you love football and if you love sports. And I have some pictures here of him, and this is his. This is my grandfather, his senior picture, which he was a senior, I guess, in the 1923-24. When he talked to me, he was basically talking about his senior year being 1923, but he would have graduated, I think, in 24. And to me, the most interesting part would be this picture here, which is of his junior and senior year. Wilkinson High School football went undefeated and was given a title by some group in the ISHAA of state champions. And so my grandfather here was this character holding the football, if I can hold that still enough for the camera. And he's actually holding the football, and it says right on there, 1923, which would have been, in the fall, that would have been his senior year. And so I find him an interesting story, because football was so much different then, right down to the football uniforms they wore. Of course, the helmets were the leather helmets with the flaps on the side. And for him, one of the interesting parts was the shoulder pads. The shoulder pads were held together by shoelaces. And one of those years, and I can't remember, I was trying to remember today, which year the shoestring broke on one of his shoulder pads, and he took a knee to the collarbone, and it broke his collarbone, and so he went on the injured list for a little while. He played the position of fullback on offense, and of course then everybody was a two-way player. Played
What's that mean?
Both offense and defense. On defense, he was a linebacker, and being a fullback was kind of an important position then, because they didn't throw the ball as often as we do today. And so it was hand the ball off to one of either the running back or the fullback, and it was a really power type football strategy. And he was also the punter and the kicker.
My heavens.
And this particular...
Was he the cheerleader too?
I kind of imagine he did a little of that too.
Okay.
This particular senior class of his was an extremely talented group. And they went undefeated most of their high school careers.
Now, this is the Brown Township High School that's in Wilkinson. That's nothing but the gym left today.
The only thing left is the gym. In fact, the picture that I showed you, they're actually right next to what is the gym. There used to be a door on the side in front of the gym, and notice, I don't know if you could notice, but I noticed that the walls, the brick walls on the back of this picture, there's white marks on it. And I was like, why did they let paint? That's not paint. That's the chalk from the erasers, and they'd take them out there on the walls, and they would beat the erasers on the wall to clean the erasers. And I thought that was kind of, they didn't even get rid of that for this football picture. I thought that was kind of interesting. And a part of past history, nobody is cleaning chalk erasers now.
Yeah, vacuums, don't they?
Well, and we mostly use whiteboards with markers today. And this picture here is of his senior class. And again, he is sitting on the front row, but in this time he is more over here to the side. He had really curly hair that he lost almost all of it immediately upon graduation from high school. And
I know that feeling.
I inherited that from him for sure. So that is his graduating class. So, their uniforms were pretty fragile and lots of injuries. Today we're really concerned about the helmets and the technology that can eliminate concussions as much as possible. But with them, it was just a covering, a leather covering, and flaps. I don't think they used any mouthpieces, so there were a lot of dental issues. That was part of it. But the other thing that is interesting about football in his era,
1920s.
Yes, and we were talking about 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And were the rules. The rules were different and were really huge change from today.
How so?
Well, one of the rules was that if you made a substitute, if the coach wanted to make a substitute, he could do that, but the player who was sent in to be the substitute could not go to the huddle and carry a gameplay.
Oh.
They had to stand aside alone and not get into the huddle until a play had actually taken place, because the folks who came up with the rules of football for the high school on that day wanted to eliminate the coaching aspect. They wanted it to really be the players, not the coach. And so they would not allow that substituting player to enter the huddle until one place had taken place. I find that a fascinating aspect. The rules and the uniforms really had a major effect on what football looked like in that day.
Did your grandpa talk much about his football days?
He talked a lot about it, and being such a small town, now I think Brown Township had close, not quite, but close to 2,500 people in that day.
Probably still.
And Wilkinson today has about 450 people.
Yes, that's right.
And I think it was probably larger in that day. And I don't know how far out, I don't know that much about Wilkinson High School region area, but I imagine it was pretty consuming of Brown Township. But one of his favorite stories was, here was this little school going undefeated against the one class system big schools. And one of them was Newcastle High School
Oh, yeah.
that they played. And he loved to tell the story of going up either that junior or senior year, and I think they played them both years. But one year, Newcastle, their team and their fans all came on the streetcar, which ran on the railroad track from Newcastle to Wilkinson, and it was a home game for Wilkinson. And when the fans and players came from Newcastle, they had a campaign where they were all holding broomsticks. And the posters and all the rhetoric was, we're going to sweep Wilkinson right off the map of Indiana.
Didn't do it, did they?
I don't think they scored. So, and the Wilkinson team just, had a big offensive day against Newcastle. And my grandfather was an interesting athlete in that he was about 5'10" tall, but he weighed about 190 pounds. He ran the 100-yard dash in 10 seconds flat, without track shoes, on grass, and without starting blocks. And so he was really a big guy, but very fast. And then one of my children, my youngest son, ended up looking exactly like him in body shape and even facial characteristics. And he was fast and big like that, and for Eastern Hancock. And then they went on his senior year, junior and senior year, and went to regionals here, and very similar, played same positions as my grandfather in at least in college he did. And but that was one of my grandfather's favorite stories. Another one of my grandfather's favorite stories was after his senior year, junior and senior year going undefeated, in the springtime, they had not been practicing because they were seniors. But their coach scheduled a scrimmage game against Butler University varsity.
Oh, my.
And their coach had a connection to Butler. In fact, he was the reason that it was the Wilkinson High School Bulldogs, and their colors were blue and white, is that he was a graduate of Butler University, brought the mascot of the Bulldogs from Butler and the colors, and they scheduled this spring scrimmage of high school boys undefeated against Butler's varsity. And none of my grandfather's team had been practicing at all. And they went out and played Butler varsity to a 0-0 tie. And my grandfather said the next day he was unable to get out of bed. He was too sore. Those are two of his favorite stories.
I knew a guy in Wilkinson. His name was Carlton. He was the president of the town board for a long time. And I think that the only high school in Brown Township was Wilkinson High School. There was a Warrington High School, but when they built the Wilkinson High School, they closed the Warrington High School down.
That makes sense.
And he drew me a map, and there was a lot more to Wilkinson at one time, but the nemesis of some of these small towns in Indiana is fire sort of wipes it out, and they had a hand pumper. They would take the fires, but the guys would say that they were so out of breath by the time they got to the fire, they couldn't pump it. So, a lot of things burned down, but was there a football field there in Wilkinson?
Yes, there was one there to where the high school was. And I should mention one of the other players of the football team that in the same class as my grandfather was Mr. Kondo of Kondo
Funeral Home,
Funeral and Mortuary. And he was the quarterback, and he was an extremely gifted athlete. And do you have time for another story?
Yeah.
That involves Mr. Kondo. They went to Wilkinson football team went to the referee and said, "Here's what we're going to do." And it was a perfectly legal play. But they were playing someone, and they got up to the line, lined up, and Mr. Kondo then started arguing that somebody on the other team had committed a penalty, an infraction, and really started jawing with that player that he was accusing of the infraction. And finally, he's kind of screaming and hollering. He says to the center, "Give me that ball. I'm going to mark off the penalty myself." And he started marking off the penalty. And then when he got beyond the linebackers of the other team, ran for a touchdown. and you have to understand, in that day, football was just being organized, and I don't think everybody felt like they knew what was going on with all the rules.
Sure.
And he had several stories kind of like that. And of course, he would tell them he just loved that story of Mr. Kondo going for the touchdown, marking off his own penalty.
Now, I know your one son played football. Micah, is that who played it? Or
No, Jonathan.
John played
Jonathan.
football. And then your daughter's two boys play football. Is that right?
I have one grandson that plays football for Mount Vernon.
Did you play football?
I played 1 year at Knightstown. My senior year, Coach Don Willard asked me to come out. Sadly enough, when I was going to Wilkinson or Eastern, they did not have football anymore. And so I didn't have a chance to play until we moved. And that second year, they talked me into playing football, and I'm sure glad I did it. If nothing else, just be able to play football and get to know Coach Willard, who coached Knightstown for over 40 years and just passed away, I believe, this last year.
I thought Indiana was a basketball state.
Well, football has a way of really being loved by the people who do it. I was, first of all, a basketball player, loved basketball. But I really enjoyed football, and I especially enjoyed my grandfather, and he absolutely loved football. And one of my memories of going into his house and on Monday night, and there he had Monday Night Football on, which included Howard Cosell, who my grandfather was not a fan of Howard Cosell. So he would have the volume down, and he would kind of do the play-by-play if you were sitting there with him, because his other frustration was the lack of knowledge of the media when they were doing football games, and he was a real football student.
You have a picture of your grandpa there?
I do.
Right there in front of you.
This is one of my favorite pictures of my grandfather.
Pretty sturdy looking guy.
Yes, he was a big guy, and as you can see, he lost all that curly hair. And the little boy in that picture is me, and in the background is also my cousin. And my cousin and I worked together at...
What's your cousin's name?
Donna Franklin.
Okay.
And we worked together in doing ministry at World Renewal that we described earlier. But this is Christmas, and for my grandfather, Christmas was a great opportunity to tell the story of Christmas. And it was a big deal to him. He wanted to do Christmas right. He wanted, most of all, for us to know the story of Jesus Christ. And he developed a habit on Christmas. We always had Christmas as a family there on Christmas Eve. And he would, after he would tell the Bible story, and before we opened the presents, he would have us all stand in a circle and hold hands. And he would look at us and say, "Now, I don't want this circle broken. I want all of you to go to heaven." And he would describe to us that we needed to make sure we had apologized to God for our sin and lived like Jesus. And he did that every year. And when it didn't matter who you were, when you were standing in that circle and those steel blue eyes looked at you and said, now, I don't want this circle broken. You didn't want to break it.
Are you a fan of football today?
Am I what?
A fan of football today?
Oh, absolutely. And so is my wife. My wife, who knew nothing of football, is such a fan that if you're sitting in the family room in the TV room and you come in and the Colts, or really just about any major game is being played on television and you're not watching it, she will come in and say, how come you don't have the game on? and so I'm kind of blessed that way because I love football and love sports. And
Do you have any other stories?
well, I suppose that the whole idea of the idea of the equipment, and I think my grandfather he constantly talked about that time when he went through the line and the shoestring had broke on his shoulder pad, and how that affected him not being able to play a portion of this I believe it was his junior season.
Oh, okay.
And he would talk about how muddy the field would get,
Yeah.
and they didn't have the
No
cleats.
turf or nothing like
They
that.
didn't have the cleats. And one of his stories was that one of the most miserable times playing football, it was cold, and yet it wasn't freezing, and there were big puddles of water. And the coach decided the best way to handle the mud and the cold was to start out by going and jumping into the mud puddle first. And my grandfather said, we were so cold the rest of the game that it was hard to play.
Yeah.
No heaters on the sideline, no big coats, and that was what you would call probably a poor coach's decision, which, having coached a little bit, I've made a lot of poor coaching decisions.
This is Joe Scavarina. We're stepping back into time. History in so many cases are more than just the battles, the dates, the buildings. It's people. And we're getting into history as people, and the people that produce and tell the stories, the people that act the part, the people that build our communities. So I've told you everything I know and some things I don't. Gary, talk to me.